Have you ever noticed how things in the world are slipping wildly out of your control? I mean, we used to have a kind of social contract, and the vast majority of us were on the same page. Political affiliations were usually just different methods and viewpoints to solve the same problem. But with the world seemingly on fire, I don't feel as connected to it all as I used to. My opinions aren't with a sweeping majority anymore. They're one voice among 350 million. So, how does that translate if I'm, say, in the world of Game of Thrones? If I'm a character that isn't vying for the throne, not one of the royal families, then what does the world look like through their eyes? The psychology of characters is pretty important when they're not the ones making the big decisions on the fate of the world, but that doesn't mean they can't change it. Before we get into it today, I'd like to mention how much I'd appreciate maybe a little of that, like and subscribe action. If you could touch that button. God, I swore I wasn't going to make this weird again this week. You know what? If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to hear the latest out of my mouth hole. There. Nailed it. So, let's dig a little deeper into what the problem is that we're trying to solve here. While understanding the psychology of your characters is always important, it can be especially relevant when they aren't world shakers or big players. Why is that? Well, it's easy to get what you want when you're king or a great wizard. Demand it, write a law for it, then use the power of your station or your minions to enforce it. People like that aren't used to hearing the word no. But what about the rest of us? Sometimes, the people who are viewed as the most powerless can truly cause massive damage. Part of that is always going to be about right place, right time, and your writing is likely going to be about that exact same time and place. Who is the character that's rising in this moment? What is going on in their head that makes them uniquely suited for the story you've made so compelling? It's hard not to bring up Fight Club in moments like these. You want to talk about someone that isn't particularly relevant in the world, someone powerless, a character that makes a sudden and violent change to the world that they live in? Look no further than the movie Fight Club. We have an insomniac insurance adjuster and an outgoing anarchist that makes soap. To grab back the masculinity they feel was stolen from them by modern culture, they create a fight club where members beat each other up to feel what combat is like, to feel alive. Now, without getting too much deeper into the plot, let's start with the elevator pitch. What is the psychology of these two people that decide to do such a thing? You have to imagine that they feel boxed in, as though their cubicles and apartments are prisons. As a matter of fact, in the film and the book alike, this notion of being imprisoned by consumerism is a message that resonates with a surprisingly large group of men, and the Fight Club grows exponentially. The solution of the Fight Club isn't an elegant one, quite the opposite. It's bruised faces and missing teeth. It's meeting in dark basements and hurting each other in a shared sentiment of bonding over violence. It's also kind of desperate when you think about it, that pummeling your neighbors is the only way to reclaim the spirit of the warrior that's been lost to peaceful times. But also, it's a dangerous message, isn't it? Because it resonates with so many others, and it creates and perpetuates its own underground movement. Eventually, the thing they've created will take on a life of its own, right? It'll become a movement bigger and more powerful than the people responsible for it. It sounds like it would be even more dangerous if someone took all this pent-up aggression and started pointing it in a direction, right? This is the essence of what we're talking about today, how the psychology of your character makes them central to the story you're telling, but also to the world they're inhabiting. Now, the Fight Club example is interesting because we're talking about two nobodies that came to shape the world they live in, right? This is one of the few similarities Fight Club shares with, say, a hero's journey like Star Wars or The Matrix, where a person of humble means rises up to change the world. Very unlike the hero's journey, the outcome isn't born from morality and isn't trying to set the world right or have good triumph over evil. Now, what happens when the scope isn't that big, though? Let's start by defining our terms. World is the place the characters inhabit in your story. Character is the person or people that we're focused on, and psychology is the thought processes behind the character that drive them and inform the decisions they make in the story. So, for example, if we're going to go all out and change the entire planet, say Game of Thrones style, we'd say that the world is Westeros, the characters are the members of all these competing houses, and of course the psychology is dependent on the main character at the time. It was more obvious in the books, of course, because each character had the spotlight in any given chapter as we bounced around, but the show handles this pretty well too. I said small scope though, right? So today we're also going to be looking at the Alfred Hitchcock classic Psycho. As we saw in the previous example of Fight Club, stories can have deep psychology and still be a drama, social commentary, and pretty darn funny at times. The audience that adores things like true crime and horror also enjoy understanding a broken mind. As a matter of fact, I'd say that's a huge part of the fun. But deep psychology and character introspection are most common as a result of this in the thriller genre. I could have picked from a dozen exceptional films for today, whether it was Silence of the Lambs, Memento, Misery, Jacob's Ladder, all of which I highly encourage watching. But this also happens to be a genre most synonymous with unreliable narrators, so check out last week's episode on plot twists for more details on that. For Psycho, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, you will not find a more stripped-down, streamlined movie with as much depth and daring narrative decisions as this film. First of all, the cast list is astonishingly small. We're talking about count the cast on your fingers small. A decent number of stage plays have more actors involved than this movie. Second, the world itself is so small, encompassing these few people in this tiny, remote place. No matter what the outcome of the story is, no one outside of our characters is really going to be affected at all. Fair warning, of course, spoilers are ahead, but if you haven't seen this film yet, you absolutely should. Spoilers don't do this film justice at all. For those that don't know, Psycho is the 1960 film that tells the story of Marion Crane. At the start of the film, she's embezzled a ton of money from the company that she works for and decides to go on the run. She stops at a remote location, opting to keep a low profile at a roadside space called the Bates Motel. When she checks in, she's surprised to find that Norman Bates, the proprietor, appears to be the only one there. No guests, nothing. He tells her about his ailing mother that lives in the house overlooking the motel. Here's where it gets shocking. Marion appears to be murdered by Mrs. Bates. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. The main character is killed halfway through the movie. We pick up the second half as Marion's sister Lila and Marion's boyfriend Sam unite to start looking for her. Inevitably, they follow the trail of breadcrumbs back to the Bates Motel until they learn the horrible secret about what happened. Why is this a great example of understanding character psychology? Well, first we start with Marion Crane. She's stolen $40,000 from her company. To understand, that's the equivalent of almost $500,000 by today's standards. What drove her over the edge and made her do this? When we switch over to Sam's half of the story, we don't hear these protestations of love or how much he misses her. Even if Marion did all this for him, so they could be together, there's this distance between them and a certain coldness to their relationship. Perhaps it wasn't what she thought it was. Even Marion's sister Lila approaches her sister's disappearance almost on the company's behalf, talking about how much trouble she's in. If Lila finds her alive, we can almost imagine she's going to force Marion to turn herself in, no matter what the reason was. Then there's Norman. Oh my god, Norman. You could sit here for an hour going over the psychology of this dude, and many people have. Norman was a mama's boy, we get that much from the narrative. It was such a predominant feature of his life that he refers to it as a private trap. These words are so much more impactful when we understand that Norman has dissociative identity disorder. His mother is long dead. He assumes her persona and carries out this awful killing of Marion. It's not his old, infirm, controlling mother that kills the first woman to come into his life. No, Norman does it, but still blames his mother. He's a victim of her mentality long after she's gone. His private trap is that he is the instrument of his greatest trauma. His mother can't really be dead so long as she still has control over him. Now that she lives on inside of his mind, he can never be free of her. You can look at great, deep stories of our time. Anyone. Pick your favorite. But you can look at these stories like the characters have these spheres representing their personality makeup, their psychology. The author builds up that psychology in each of these characters to one degree or another. Then they set these personalities loose in the narrative and watch them bounce off of each other. Norman's first encounter with a pretty woman his own age coincides with this horrible time in his life when his mind has been split in two. Even if he was romantically interested in her, it doesn't matter. The mother in this story is a character whose shadow looms large, even though she's completely dead. Lila feels duty-bound to bring her sister in and do the right thing. Sam is trying to make sense of Marion's actions and hoping that she didn't steal all that money on his behalf. Every single scene in Psycho is tight and confined. One room, 2 or 3 people. It's so intimate that it feels like the story could be going on right now in the next town over from yours, and you'd never know it. Police capture Norman as a murder suspect. It gets buried on page 4 of the local newspaper, and you never hear about it again. The Bates Motel is demolished and turned into a Dollar General. The story is lost to history. But for Marion, this was the end of her life. For Lila and Sam, uncovering the truth will change them forever. For Norman, well, he's already living in his own personal hell. Prison isn't going to change that. So, the world of Psycho is affected by all of this, but the world at large just keeps on chugging along. You see how that works? You can make your characters incredibly deep, and you can set them off to go and change the world, or just their small corner of it. Fight Club to Psycho, large scale to small scale. But DC, how do I write deep characters like this myself? Well, guy who talks to your screen, I'm glad you asked. I'm going to share 2 different methods I use for adding depth to your characters. Now, this is my method that I've used for my writing, and you'll undoubtedly find your own, but hopefully this will be a great jumping off point. The first method would be reverse engineering. Often, storytellers come up with a cool concept first, or a plot twist, or the theme of their story, and then build out from there. If you want characters with depth that are worthy of the cool idea you have, what I'll often do in the early planning stages is figure out where the story's going to wind up, and work backwards to how this particular character I've created has gotten there. Basically, you start from your premise and ask yourself, what did that character do to get here? Then, as you're filling in the details, their psychology starts to develop before you. Well, if this character ends up in a strange city to find their lost friend, they must care for that person a lot. Does this city make them uncomfortable? Is that because they don't like being unfamiliar with a place, or because they're used to rural areas? Okay, they grew up on a farm. Have they ever left their small hometown, or have they been there all their life? What skills do they bring to the table that make them capable of this task? You see that? The more we work backwards and flesh out the character, we start going further back in their life and telling us what their demeanor and behaviors were at the start of the story, before all this started. Once you have that baseline, it informs your storytelling as you move forward, which brings me to my next method. Let the character surprise you. While I have reverse engineered many characters in my storytelling, I am a bit of a planner. No pantsing for me. As such, I'm often trying to develop a character and their psychology very early on and get a bit of a timeline for where they were before the start of the story. If you're comfortable with psychology, you can use that knowledge to inform character behaviors and thought processes behind their actions. You'll find doing it this way, you'll often end up with a character that's a mishmash of the personalities of people you probably know. At that point, it isn't much of a stretch to throw a trial or a situation at these characters without much clue as to how the scene's going to unfold. You can say, this is how I want the scene or chapter to end, and then just throw the character in and start writing. Let them surprise you. Write how you know they'd react, what they'd do in the situation, while gently steering the narrative toward the outcome you wanted at the end of the chapter. It can be a wonderful journey, and I found some of my most interesting characters told me how they'd behave instead of the other way around. Creating characters with depth is a great undertaking, but the benefits are equal to the work you put in. Invest in your characters. They're not just tools to move your story forward. Give them life and let them be people, even people that say or do things you fundamentally disagree with. If you let them be themselves, that's how you get memorable characters. I mean, this guy doesn't have a name, neither in the book or the movie. He is called the narrator. If you love this movie, you probably quoted him a dozen times, and he doesn't have a name. Let that sink in. Well, that's about all the time we have for this week, folks. Make sure to let me know in the comments anything you'd like to see me cover in future episodes. You should also sign up and check out my newsletter. I send it out twice a month and talk about my books and what I'm working on, as well as showing off some indie authors so you can find your next great read. The link's in the description below. And everybody that signs up gets Cora Blake Arcane Agent for free. It's an awesome urban fantasy action story that's also the prequel to my Dragon's Dream saga. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, have fun and get crafting.